Lev actually touched on so many issues when he invited me to give this talk. And one of the most important things you just described was this launch pad of California Institute of the Arts, which, looking back, was so prescient in terms of where we are today. And in many ways, it was the formative experience of my life, because we had electronic composers, Anne Halprin, the famous dancer, daughter of Lawrence Halprin. We had John Baldessari, as you said, and an amazing cauldron of individuals who all were looking at the future, which seemed that it was around the corner. It's now been nearly 50 years, and it's now tantalizingly just around the corner. And so I thought, when you asked me to look at this idea, I've been possessed of the idea of the impact that media and technology would have on our urban structures, and especially on what might transpire if this grid, which we're so accustomed to referring to when we address things, when we send the mail, everything turns out to be a grid. And I thought, well, what if we didn't have one? And I thought, to talk to you guys, I would go back and look at, why do we have a grid? And what does it do for us? And has that been such an indelible part of everyone's life up until now? So, oh, you've got that up already. Good. This is Piranesi looking at Rome and seeing it as a pile of enclaves, individual kind of places which are defined like they might be in a riverbed. This is the real Rome, again, by Piranesi. And you can see that the negative spaces between the buildings are where all the traffic is. That's where everybody went, between the buildings. And the only grid-like things are the structures within the buildings. Now, it evidently did not appear to people, did not occur to them, that perhaps they could structure the city, this grandest city of all the epochs, almost ever, with some kind of external structuring system. Now, the Romans did take a different attitude when they went outside of the city, and I'll get to that in just a moment, because you can see here that there are very persistent grids in the heroic Roman structures. And if we look closer at Nolli's map, you can see within these blanked out spaces, the public spaces all have a column grid, and it's all regular. And you wonder, why is that? How come they had this very strong discontinuity between public space and ceremonial space? And as they went forward into France, Germany, and all of these other areas, their advancing troops would arrange themselves in a grid-like pattern. Now, you have to surmise, what were they doing that for? Was that because of the military organization? Was that because the commander required his troops to be in a certain array? They actually built these camps in rectilinear fashion with a grid within them, so that in many, many cases, this is one of their famous campgrounds, which still exists here. It's the Roman city of Timgad. You can wonder what made them lay out their vassal towns in this way rather than their own hometowns. What made them think, was this to collect taxes so they could identify that you right over there, you owe us 2 barrels of wheat? There was a very different rigor in terms of the way that they thought about the organization of their towns. So this organization went forward quite a ways, and many, 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 individuals of heroic stature thought about city plans. This is Da Vinci's plan about the 16th century, early 16th century, 1502. And there's not a straight line in it. It's not there. So you think that even among thinkers, this idea of a very rigid organization of a city was not part of their process. The city was, in fact, thought of more as a family of forms that all congregated around a religious place or a place that would disseminate the culture. And as it went forward, this is Palma in northern Italy, and the centrality issue still existed, although here comes geometry all of a sudden. This is the actual city. I couldn't believe it. They actually built this city, and it still exists today exactly like this, which asserts the power of geometry over everything. It got in a slightly diluted form. In others, this is Mallorca, and you can kind of see around it the vague orientations that were visible in Palma. And Ming and I have been to the city of Carcassonne. I'm sure many, many, many of you have. And again, the intrigue of these medieval cities, the luxury of wandering through streets and not knowing what you're going to find around the next corner is intoxicating. It's truly, truly an amazing experience. And yet, at some point in time, this organizational idea went away. I think probably it had something to do with the intellectual revolution of the Renaissance. It's pure speculation because I am, if anything, not a scholar. But I love images. I just love images. So this one of Tycho Brahe has always inspired me. Brahe was an astronomer. He built his buildings as instruments, much like Einstein's Mendelssohn Tower. And the instrumentality of his interest in astronomy was echoed by the invention of the astrolabe, by the invention of the very first surveying tool. And given a tool where you can suddenly align things, where you can suddenly make things add up, was an astonishing invention. I'm going to deviate for a second, Ming. Ming and I were in Urumqi, it's a Chinese city, and we went to a vineyard, and this is totally off script, but I have to say this. And the vineyard is in a desert, and they irrigate the desert by underground tunnels. And what they do is they dig down to a point, and they light a candle at that point. And then, as long as they can see the candle, they know they're going in a straight line. And when they dig back up, they put another candle there, and now they have a fix. And now when they deviate by something, they put another candle. And they can navigate underground by the candles in the tunnels. Analog, perfect, beautiful system. So I think that this brought some of that idea of systemization to the layout of cities. This is a late drawing based on a Vitruvius city plan that was later drawn in about 16th century. And if you look closely, I wish I could zoom in, but if you look closely at this, you'll see there are very, very powerful organizing lines, and then little scribbles inside of each of the cells, indicating a kind of biological activity there in the middle of the cells, which is defined by the grander pattern. And this idea began to catch fire, especially in this drawing, which is a plan for London in the middle of the 17th century. And it lays out a perfect grid with little courtyards in the middle of each square. I don't think London ever adopted it except in certain areas. But it's interesting to watch the chronology of how the idea of a grid began to take place and to be a preferred way of organizing cities for commerce, identity, restrictions, law, all of those things. What was everybody else doing who was interested in freedom of thought, experience, lifestyle, etc.? They were imagining utopias. That's what Thomas More was doing at exactly the same time. And look at his utopia. There's not a straight line in it. I think it's fascinating that we don't have an ordering system that kind of seems to bridge between these two realities. And even in projective images, this is much later. This is a century after Thomas More's utopia. And this is for an entire continent, an illusory utopian continent. And again, not a straight line in it, by a visionary artist. His name is Hohmann. We haven't heard of him, but that's who did it. And so I think this idea of imposing a grid on a voluptuous living city is a very strange idea. It's not a logical idea. It's logical in terms of, as I said, commerce, identity, and so forth. But insofar as giving us pleasure, it doesn't seem to be where the great thinkers were going. Now, obviously, religion has a lot to do with this, to be quite candid. And when William Penn, who was a Quaker, went to found Philadelphia, his plan, which was based on Puritan principles of the Quaker religion, was to try to give each person equal standing, to eliminate hierarchy, to make individuals have their own chance at life. Philadelphia was called the city of brotherly love. This is, in a funny way, a kind of mirror of that idea that Penn brought with him. He even brought it to the cemetery. This is the charter for Philadelphia's first cemetery. And the corpses are neatly arranged in rows. It blew my mind. I mean, I thought, this is a pervasive idea. This is an idea which you can't fight with. Yet, at the same time, here was a city like Paris, which was a jumble of streets, complete chaos. Along came a more refined surveying tool. And what happened? Napoleon hired Haussmann. And Haussmann just started to barrage these streets through Paris in pursuit of an even more emphatic aristocracy, all centering around this center of a city, at the service, making the city at the service of the aristocracy. Well, it was also involved with accuracy and beauty, but it was certainly not involved with practicality. That was where New York City's grid came in. And this was 40 years before Haussmann. This is coming and extruded from the Penn system in Philadelphia. And this grid was commissioned by the city of New York in 1810. We're a long way back. And at close up, you can see the Wall Street area is a jumble of streets. That's what the Amsterdam folks came and paid the dollar for, so forth and so on. But immediately after that, there's a pervasive grid. And the terrain of New York City at that time was very hilly. This is a section through the terrain. Well, that was not going to stand in the way of New York City's grid. They rammed that through the hills. They left farmhouses standing on the top of their land with no way to get down to the street. This was an imperial gesture of great, great meaning and huge importance. And the commitment to it is, you could not possibly do that today in today's world. But they realized that if they did that, every lot could be sold in advance. Every shop owner would have equal access to traffic. And the whole city would be a real estate boom, which it was. Now, it had certain downsides to it, of course, but it was echoed throughout the United States when Jefferson laid down his 1-mile grid all the way across the United States. This is Jeffersonian's grid, Western Reserve. Every city, every state reflects this all the way across the United States. This is Indianapolis. There's the grid. And this is the grid laid all the way across the United States. So we have become habituated to this idea of a grid. Ming and I did a project in Spreckles in California. Perfect grid. The Spreckles sugar people. But that was the way that you laid out a city. You all know, I don't have a picture of it, that in San Francisco they laid the grid over the city without regard to the hills, sold off the properties, built the roads. That's why they're so steep. You know, that's why Steve McQueen really got into it. That was it. So this is the terrain of the United States and the way that it is organized by grids. And the grids have another quality. They love anomalies. The anomalous condition within a grid attracts business and commerce and life. And so these diagrams of Manhattan show, you can see along, does this work? Works, okay. You can see this is Broadway right here. And this is a map of the growth of commerce from the initial state of Manhattan Island. And as commerce grows up along Broadway and then around Central Park, it's like an X-ray. And of course, at that intersection of Broadway and all the most important parts of buildings of New York, you get a condition which is very remarkable and which results in something like the Flatiron Building. Now, the Flatiron Building was built in about 1900, sometime around there. Now, if you think about the year 1900, it's when Harley Davidson built his first motorcycle. It's when Edison built the first electric motor. It's when telephone and business and radio, this is a radio station, portable. And when people thought the unthinkable about city plans, it was a moment of incredible ferment. I like to think that it's parallel to our moment today. When the existing systems are inadequate, they don't quite work yet. And there are new ideas bubbling up because of that. And this is one, I just happen to be fond of it, thought I'd show it to you guys. This is the guy who invented the straight razor, Gillette. And Gillette created an ideal city around this hexagonal plan. I've been fascinated with this for years. He designed it all the way down to the trucks that would deliver vegetables, which were to be porcelain coated because he was a germaphobe. And so the delivery systems were all underground. There's a section through his ideal city, and you can see all this substructure and infrastructure underneath the garden area. And, of course, the endless apartments and so forth and so on. I know it's really funny, but it represents just how radical thinking was beginning to be at that point. Because imagine, the telephone comes in and festoons your city with more wires than you can count, right? Because people want to communicate. And so the wires are all over the place, and suddenly the lobbies of buildings are no longer useful because you phone ahead. You don't sit in the lobby as a shoe salesman for weeks on end before you can get an audience with the shoe manufacturer. So in many ways, this communication brought down the iconography of the city. It brought down the symbolism of the city. It brought down all of that. And suddenly, the city was like a pulse, different information running through it at the speed of light. And there was just no more need for this kind of information. It was irrelevant. It was in the yellow pages, and now it's on your iPhone. So you begin thinking about that, and certain images create the memory capture, the memory of the city as a dynamic thing. Now this was in 1940 when Mondrian had just come over from France. He had been painting his very sincere rectilinear paintings prior to this, but he came to New York, and I think he must have thought he died and went to heaven, because this New York energized him, and he said, wow, Boogie Woogie, how cool is that? And he paints a big picture of Boogie Woogie, and at the same time, Norman Bel Geddes, it's the same time, Norman Bel Geddes says, we're in the middle of incipient gridlock. We need freeways. So the romance of New York City is getting attacked now by the visionary Norman Bel Geddes, who is saying, well, wait a minute. It takes too long, 4 miles to go in stop and go traffic? That's no good. Now think, that was 60 years ago, when he was already frustrated by traffic, as I am. Ming and I live in Los Angeles, and Sunset Boulevard is impassable most hours of the day. And Bel Geddes was looking at that, and he was proposing multi-layered cities, cities in which the grid and the freeway freed traffic from shopping areas. This was this General Motors pavilion at the 1939 World's Fair, which demonstrated the idea of freeway. Corbusier picked up on it. Everybody picked up on it. Assembly lines now were really, 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 organized along a grid. And this idea of the grid as a be-all, end-all sort of was a fire. It was a flame. I think the addressability had to do with it. I think the visual economy of it as an idea, very easy to understand, right? Not complex, you didn't have to ponder it. But when Corbusier was building Chandigarh, he had a super grid, but look inside of the grid. It's all fluid, lively shapes. So that Corbusier was looking for a balance between the two. One for transport, one for life. Even Levittown had a very similar theme. The Levittown that we all hear about, oh, it's so boring, it's so uniform, all the houses are the same, et cetera, et cetera. But we all know that the way that people have now lived in it and furnished it, it makes it a very accommodating place to live. And Levitt himself, in the layout of Levittown, sort of was trying to find a balance between the suppleness of a fluid form and the grid. And I think even Frank Lloyd Wright was trying to do that with the Guggenheim. You know, well, the bottom of it's a grid, the top of it isn't, and no, maybe there's some space in between which is exciting, right? But he wasn't quite able to break the grid at the ground level. He really had to give it a podium on which to create another space. And of course, the be-all and end-all of the grid, and Ming and I just had a drink down the street at the Mies building. It's a magnificent building. It's great. And there's no question that this architecture is the perfect embodiment of a grid, but it's not today's reality, I think. Even the advertising agencies and those in our part of the country, in Los Angeles, prefer to be in a warehouse. And so this is like the ideal totem. It's the marker for the preeminence of that thought pattern and of that organizational strategy. It's the time when the book, The Organization Man, was written. It's Mad Max time, and we love to think about Mad Max. But we have all these other means at our disposal now. And it's an interesting thing that the challenges to the grid, whether it was Bucky Fuller, Henry Dreyfuss with looking at human factors, were all in counterposition to this. This is in Russia. This is people trying to show their identity in a Russian apartment building and to express that. And of course, the Italian group Superstudio made a fetish of the grid, furnishings, city plans, all kinds of things, which are all emblazoned with the grid. And finally, of course, in the endless city of Superstudio, which was an all-consuming grid throughout the world. And I like to think of this as kind of the apotheosis of the grid, the things which carried it into our memory banks, into our popular culture, into the most available access we have to the city. But I think there's a thirst out there which reaches beyond the systematic imposition of the grid. Bernard Tschumi exploited it to probably the most satisfying human dimension by simply populating the park with icons that were spaced evenly and told you as you were walking through the grass or, diving down deep into the earth, that there was a grid, but it was virtual. They were virtual lines between the icons. They weren't hard lines. You could perambulate as you pleased between them. And the other person who I think, exploited the grid to a great extent is Rem Koolhaas, because he made it a plaything. Totally, right? Oh, gosh, I can play chess on this. I can put all kinds of fanciful objects within the grid without violating the grid, which is incredible insight, actually. And I think it's driven a lot of city plans since. When it gets as totalizing as this, I have a little bit of a problem with it. But were it to be furnished in a very elaborate way, it might still have a lot of vibrancy in it. The opposition, of course, to that thrust of design was to be found mostly in the kind of rebellion of the English architects. And this sort of, I think this had something to do with kind of rebelling against I worked for Jim Sterling for a while, and I know how insouciant he was, how much he was anxious not to be aligned with the royals, how important it was for him to differentiate himself by wearing lime green socks, for instance, to formal weddings. And that insouciance was something which I think then was picked up by a lot of English culture, resulting in the work of Archigram and their sort of rambunctious attitudes, sort of city planning. And Danny Libeskind, who came out of the AA, again with a view toward city organizations as kind of almost indecipherable city plans, which in many ways just represented the kind of parametric thing you might get from crumpling a piece of paper. That there is order, but it's a higher level of order. It's an order which has to do with the physics and the crumpling and the dynamics of the interventions, and in a very supple way. Now, at the most primitive level, it's what you find in the favela. In the favela, where almost everything is improvised, almost everything is part of the fluidity of daily life, of whether you can scavenge a piece of corrugated metal or you can scavenge a piece of cardboard and assemble something which is part of your domestic reality, but also has to melt into this larger urban reality. It's incredibly complex. It's impossible to imagine drawing or designing anything like that other than by energizing and validating the work of many, many individuals, squeezing themselves into that network. But it's not a lot different than contemporary Tokyo. The plan of contemporary Tokyo is extremely fluid. And I remember walking some of the small streets of Tokyo with tiny little houses on them, all cramped together, and maybe 3 feet of front yard on a street that traffic is passing by. And that 3 feet of front yard is treated so preciously with very fragile items out on it. They really care about that 3 feet. But the remainder of the city is defined by these tiny little bits of personal turf. And it's extremely difficult to find your way in, right? A taxi cab has to, very often has to stop and ask directions. The way that they address places is by the time that it was built in sequence in a district. So it was built in 1952, it's 1952. Find 1952 somewhere. So the addressing system is opaque to most of our Western minds. We can't find it. And the street layout is indecipherable. But a group called Bow Wow Wow, do you know that group, architecture group? You know them? Yes. Of young Japanese architects decided they were going to document all of these incredibly small, negligible pieces of architecture and turn them into architecture. Elevate these primitive buildings into architecture. And they showed where every light switch, where the electricity entered it, and so forth and so on. So there is a way to understand it. But you've got to have the patience of God. You have to really, really care, which they did. But documentation is not what Tokyo is about, is it? It's about many, many minute moves adding up to an overall city fabric. Tom Main took a little bit of an inspiration from that in his plan for Manhattan, the west side of Manhattan. And I would talk to Tom, and I'd say, Tom, how do you buy a piece of property? How do you do anything in this? The transactions are opaque. You can't figure out what to do. But Tom was resolute in his conviction that this kind of a city offers far more in the way of vibrant urban life than the ones that we have. Now, for me, the retort is this. The retort to the confused, opaque city that none of us can make sense of, it's now in everybody's iPhone. Even people that know the city very well in Los Angeles pull out their iPhone to chart a course somewhere, even though they know it. I'm sure people do that here too. And the Uber drivers, they navigate by what? By their iPhone. And that is because of this entirely new, non-Euclidean way of identifying space. That is because of cell towers and triangulation. Your cell phone knows exactly where it is because it's triangulated. And as you all know, all you architects, a rectangle is not stable. A triangle is stable. So that's how they know exactly where your car is, wherever it is. That's how they know exactly where your house is, by triangulation. So now we have a new geometry. And this, Lev, is the one that erases the grid. This new way of space identification, finding space, erases the grid. It makes the grid a redundant factor. That triangulation goes on all the way up in the air with satellites. They know exactly where you are. No problem. It's simple math. So once you get past that idea and the world is furnished with satellites and cell towers and an entirely new overlay of geometry which encompasses the entire globe, you are truly in a different mental space. You're truly in a space in which location is now a certainty, regardless of how it's mapped, regardless of where you are, regardless of the surroundings. That's why Amazon has no problem imagining a future in which goods are delivered to you over the air. These darn little drones are able to pinpoint exactly where you are. If you're standing in the middle of a desert, they'll come and deliver a bottle of water. It is not an issue any longer. So what seemed like a real pipe dream when Bezos, is that his name? The Amazon guy? Bezos. When he started talking, I was really skeptical of this. I mean, I've got to admit, I was like, what? And then my students began playing around with drones, and children are playing with drones, and they're common objects. And you begin to realize that the destination makes no difference to a drone. And there are no stoplights in the air. And it's very, very precise. So when you begin tracking what's happening, these are taxi routes in San Francisco, or with the sort of planning of SimCity, or with what are now being, what's being thought about for autonomous vehicles. I'm working at the present time with Art Center College on some autonomous vehicle things. And the horizon that they have, they call it a level 5 autonomous vehicle, is one that knows precisely where it is. It knows precisely where the other autonomous vehicles are. It knows precisely where all the buildings are. So now suddenly, You don't need traffic lights. This is what the Art Center guys do, and they're all loonies, you know, but I think they're right. That's their specialty. So no more curbs, no more streets, no more traffic lights, traffic signs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what is that urban reality? It's a lot like ancient Rome, where you have a kind of zone where things happen. And you don't have freeways except for mass transit. Instead, you have vehicles which deliver groceries to your door, or drones that do. This happens to be a vegetable vehicle. Yeah, it's true. That's what it is. And instead of going point to point to point in your grid, you're leapfrogging around the grid like a circuit board. Now you're wired with commodity and communication. And the grid is a kind of superfluous overlay. So flocking behavior begins to be the principal mode of activity. And we're back, I think, to square one. Thank you.